Until the 1960s, the Egyptian society did not know extremist Islamic ideologies, and I am one that grew in that atmosphere at the time. At the time, Muslim brothers were a minority, and now we see them, how they have taken over the whole culture. This culture of hate has forced the Coptic community to withdraw into an ever-shrinking space from the public space into their families, churches, and their own small community. The extremist ideologies of the Salafis and the Muslim Brothers, which invaded every aspect also invaded every Islamic institution, including the Azhar.
Now, it was Copts who became the icon of ISIS genocide against Middle Eastern Christians 2 years ago with the release of a graphic video by ISIS of the 21 members of the community being ritually beheaded on a Libyan beach. Lined up, forced to kneel to their knees, and just before their throats were slit by the jihadists clad in black, the ISIS captives could be heard whispering in the audio, the Our Father, apparently an ISIS editorial slip-up. And their relatives whom I recently met, hailed them as heroes for refusing to recite the Shahada and dying with a Christian prayer on their lips. Across the rooftop of the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, where I visited not too long ago, of course, the site of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, most revered church in Christendom, the Coptic Orthodox Church has strung up a large banner that bears a still from this ISIS video of their martyrs, of their precious martyrs. And as Bishop Makarios, the top Orthodox cleric in Minya, said about Marcos and the other pilgrims on television last month, quote, "They chose death. We take pride to die while holding onto our faith."
Terrorist groups have made a point to specifically mention the Coptic Christians in their recruitment videos, and they are wreaking havoc on Egypt's Christian population. Egypt is facing a legitimate insurgency from terrorists, but the Copts have been subject to a disproportionate amount of the violence. That is a fact. I'm encouraged by President Sisi's positive statements, a state funeral that he gave to the Coptic martyrs, the multiple airstrikes he's launched in retaliations to the attacks, how he's repeatedly challenged the religious establishment in Egypt. These are all good things. In addition to conducting swift investigations to find the culprits behind the attacks, President Sisi has stood with the Copts in church, celebrating Christmas with them, and has followed through on his promise to repair all of the churches that were destroyed by the Muslim Brotherhood in 2013. President Sisi should be applauded for these actions as they are unprecedented in Egypt's history. However, more needs to be done, especially at a time when Coptic Christians are being targeted by terrorists. In his speeches, he regularly mentions that all Egyptians are equal and that the terrorists are trying to divide the fabric of Egypt through these attacks. He is absolutely correct that that is the aim of the terrorists, and that the Egyptian government should do everything possible to stop the terrorists. Since the Copts are facing a disproportionate amount of violence, they should also be part of the solution. I repeat, the Copts need to be part of the solution. As President Sisi says, Egyptians have to stand together now more than ever, and a great first step would be to show the terrorists that all Egyptians are unified in their resolve. The Egyptians could show the terrorists that they mean what they say by placing more Copts in high-level security positions in intelligence, military, and local security forces, as Copts are almost currently non-existent in these positions.
Well, I'll have to tell you, a few weeks ago, I was in Iraq and Syria for a few days, and visiting with some of the folks that were there on the ground. We changed planes in Doha, and as I changed planes in Doha, I looked up on the monitor, and all I could see was the image of a bus that had been shot, and 28 Coptic Christians being murdered on their way to go worship. And we stood in the airport around as a group and looked at the news and followed it. And all I could think was, again. This is an ongoing issue. It's been a long-term conversation. While Egypt has made great progress in statements, as Jeff Fortenberry was saying again, to be able to stand and say, we are all Egyptians, it's not the first time for President Sisi to be able to say that, and I'm glad he continues to reiterate that. But there's an ongoing work for both terrorism in the Sinai and just basic dignity and protection of all individuals to be able to practice their faith and to be able to be considered a faithful citizen of a nation, regardless of the faith practice that you have. We still have a long way to go. I visited with Rex Tillerson, who's our Secretary of State, just yesterday, and had an ongoing conversation about where are we, because there's a position called the Ambassador at Large for Religious Liberty. That position has not been filled yet. The sole role of that individual is to be able to work with our State Department to make sure that all of our embassies have an ongoing conversation in country about religious liberty, and to be able to work with other foreign ministers and with our own State Department, and to be able to travel the world with this one basic principle. How can people live in your country free, with dignity, with the same values, the same abilities, the same responsibilities as everyone else in your nation, and the same opportunities, regardless of their faith principles? That position's unfilled currently in the State Department. Secretary Tillerson told me that they have made the recommendation now to the White House. They're waiting on final response back, but they have finished their work, and within a very short period of time, we should have that ambassador's position filled, and we're looking forward to getting them back to work, to gain a chance to travel around the world and engaging with every government to be able to engage in those basic principles.
I've had a chance to meet with President Sisi just a month or two ago. His foreign minister I met with separately a month or two before that. And in every meeting, I'm talking about the protection of the Coptic community. A community that goes back to St. Mark, a community that is as Egyptian as the Nile. I get assurances, but I need you to let me know what's actually happening on the ground. And the greatest thing that President Sisi has done is dislodge the Muslim Brotherhood from the governance of Egypt. And when others, even in my own party, even in the former administration, were talking about democracy and the Brotherhood and the Brotherhood believed, of course, in one person, one vote, one time. This was not a democratic movement. This was a movement of oppression.
I think Egypt, and by extension, Egyptian nationals, and by extension, the culture of the Copts and the Christian minorities, by participating in the larger initiatives of Egypt, both there and from afar, have a decided role in bringing about the construct for future peace in the Middle East. You see, if we lose completely the concept of pluralism, that peoples, that religious minorities can possibly coexist side by side, other faith traditions, and be integrated into governance structures, be protected with the rights to religious freedom, if we can continue to build upon that foundation in Egypt and affirm that principle throughout the Middle East, then the Middle East has a chance. If we cannot, if Egypt collapses, if the prospects for pluralism in the name of justice, respect for individual dignity and the rights of conscience as it finds expression in religious freedom dies, then people will just default back to tribal, ethnic, religious allegiance, and there is no prospect for healthy governance and mutual respect. This is why I believe what you're doing is absolutely so critical. First of all, being great Americans and remaining attached to the ancient faith tradition that gives narrative and binding to your community, that continues to compel you to engage significantly in the future, not only of Egypt's stability, but in the future of the entire Middle East, which is essential for the future of humanity. Without stabilization in the Middle East, without some degree of embrace of the principles of pluralism, we undermine the principles of civilization itself.
Because here's what I know. Your right to practice your religion is only as safe as your Muslim brothers, your Jewish sisters, your Hindu fathers, your Buddhist mothers, your agnostic uncle, and your atheist aunt. In order for you or me to enjoy freedom of religion, everyone else must enjoy it as well. That's the only way it works. And the alternative is the risk of discrimination, repression, or even sectarian violence, which is exactly what we're seeing in Egypt. As a practicing Catholic and someone who has been inspired throughout my life by the Church's social justice teaching, I was heartened by Pope Francis's recent visit to Egypt, by his words and by the example that he set. The Pope's first stop in Egypt was at the Al-Azhar Mosque, where he embraced the Grand Imam and shared a platform with him. The Pope chose that setting to talk about the role of education, quote, to counter effectively the barbarity of those who foment hatred and violence, end quote. He talked about how respect for one's own identity and religious formation was a critical step to having the courage to accept differences, and how that would help the Christian and Muslim faiths walk together not as enemies, but as fellow travelers.
Last December, I authored another religious freedom law. I named it after Frank Wolf, who was the great champion of religious freedom in the U.S. House of Representatives and the entire Congress, for that matter. It's called the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act of 2016. And that legislation is multifaceted, but it finally, hopefully, will give voice and a tangible contact with our policy, because it is a whole-of-government approach to ensure that from the National Security Council and the NSC to every other aspect of our government, religious freedom will be front and center, not as an asterisk on page 4, which it was, sadly, in some of the previous administration, but it will be front and center to integrate it into our foreign policy. It requires the promulgation of religious prisoners so that we know in country X, Y, or Z who's being hurt, who's being incarcerated, and then it becomes a serious part of our bilateral relationship with that country. It also will hold to account individuals who have committed crimes based on religious freedom against people, so that if you're a government policeman, or you name it in the government, that tortures or in any way works against religious freedom, you don't get a visa. You will find that your ability to do business with the United States corporations will be severely hampered. It's got to be implemented, but it is the law. We passed it, it's been signed, and my hope is that this new IRFA enlargement, International Religious Freedom Act, will make a major difference.
You know, in the second chapter of Matthew, the Lord comes to Joseph and says, "Man, you need to get the heck out of there. King Herod's after you." And that flight to Egypt is such a great part of the traditions of our Christian faith, and the roots of Christ's visit to Egypt, and the roots of the Coptic Church and St. Mark's future evangelism in Egypt, and all that brings home true the deep relationship that Christians around the world share with our Coptic brothers and sisters.